My name is Dr. Brett Sterling. I'm a visiting assistant professor of German, and it is my pleasure tonight to introduce to you Dr. Todd Cesaratto. Dr. Cesaratto received his PhD from the University of Indiana in spring 2010, and taught as a visiting assistant professor at Miami University of Ohio before joining the German section of the World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department in fall 2013 as visiting assistant professor of German. While at the University of Arkansas, he has added innovative courses to the course offerings within the German section, including Witzwelten, Joke Worlds, a consideration of how humor works and its place in literature, Tales of a Fall, which explores literal and metaphorical falls in German literature from ethical as well as aesthetic viewpoints. And next spring, Dr. Cesaratto will be offering a course on Robert Musil's landmark novel, The Man Without Qualities. He has published in German and English on topics of heroism, humor, emotions, sports, and totalitarianism as they manifest in Austrian and German literature, German philosophy and sociology, and American fiction and film. For his teaching, he has won numerous awards and commendations. His book, Achilles' Line, The Man Without Qualities, Musil, Ulrich and Don Draper, will appear in 2015 with Northwestern University Press. The talk he will give today, At War with Words, Achilles, The Man Without Qualities, and Don Draper, is an outline of the book's premises. I would like to thank the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the German section, in particular Dr. Jennifer Hoyer, for initiating the series of lectures in German studies begun last fall, and which will hopefully continue beyond this academic year. Thanks also to Kathy Matthews for room scheduling, and especially to the German graduate students, German majors and minors, and all the other interested parties dedicated to the study and exploration of German language culture at the University of Arkansas and in Fayetteville. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Cesaratto.
Thanks, Brett, for these words of introduction. Thanks also to all of you for taking time out of your busy end of semester schedule to be here this evening. Thanks to the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, in particular to Daniel Levine, who's been a sounding board for some of my ideas regarding the classics. He's also been of invaluable help in learning pronunciations of some of the Greek names. Thanks also to Bart Belair, who helped me put together this presentation, Amelie Holland for promoting this talk, and everyone else who assisted in getting the word out. Now, as Dr. Sterling said, this talk is a distillation of the ideas from my book. And as such, I'm boiling down 250 pages into an hour. And that means some of my arguments will be carried more via assertion than by derivation. So if you spot any leaps in logic, please save that for the question and answer, and we can address that at that point. Or, if you have 8 hours, I could just go through the whole book. Good, I want to start with an interactive activity to warm us up and to get us into the heroic mind frame. I want you to ask yourselves, am I a hero? Do I use heroic role models to calibrate my behavior in everyday life? Do I strive to be heroic? Well, raise your hands if you're doing any of these things. Go ahead, raise your hands if you have any. Okay, put your hands down. Why are you putting your hands up? Somebody's going to see you, and you'll betray the fact that you don't realize that we are living in anti, non, or post-heroic times. We have the philosophical and historical arguments that prove the hero is dead. 80 years before Nietzsche announced the death of God, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was lamenting the death of the epic hero. That individual who, through the strength of his will, could shape society in accordance with his vision. But Hegel says in the modern state, we have lawyers and politicians, we have educators and businessmen, and they're all serving separate masters, and they can't be brought together under the banner of a common cause. I'm going to get to the historical argument in just a moment, but for now I want you to forget that you've just heard the news of the hero's death. And I want to focus our thoughts a little more. I want you to think of the names of the heroes that you use in calibrating your behavior. Think of their stories. And then I want you to follow me in the next step to getting into the German mindset, which will be much more stringent. We're going to only have 4 options for myths that help us define who we are in the modern world. Option 1 appeals to you if you find yourself reciting love poems to images of yourself that you see reflected in various surfaces. Option 2A will appeal to you if you have killed or plan to kill your father in order to spend more special time with your mother. Option 2B reverses the gender polarity, and if you are a woman, you want to kill your mother or have killed her because she was coming between you and your father. Option 3 applies to you if you are clever, cunning, but have a terrible sense of direction, and it always takes longer than expected to get home. And option 4 is yours if you're the best at something in some field of activity, recognizing the best, but fall into a rage if that recognition is diminished or withdrawn from you. So these 4 myths I've just listed, they are as alive and well, or unwell as the case may be, today as they were in classical literature. We have Narcissus, Electra, and Oedipus, Odysseus, and Achilles. One of these examples that I've just listed is a bad example, and I leave that up to you to figure out which one. A bad example, I mean, in terms of Germans finding a cipher for understanding their place in the world. Narcissus is ubiquitous in the social media. All the news feeds feature abundant proof of self-love. The Oedipus and the Electra story we find in the American and US versions of the Old Boy film. We find it in Boardwalk Empire, the Jimmy Domerty storyline. Odysseus is the darling of post-war and post-wall German literature because the question is often posed, can we return home again? And it's generally answered in the negative, or image of home is painted that we would not want to return to. And Achilles is also ubiquitous in world culture, where he is a positive figure, anywhere from the trilogy of the Batman films by Christopher Nolan, in the Wire series in the figure of Jimmy McNulty, the detective who has to break the law in order to uphold the law. He's the best of the detectives as well. And in the most recent James Bond installation, he is right there at the moment when Great Britain is deciding whether they still need heroes. Or rather, he is not there as M, Bond's handler, omits the first 2 lines of the Tennyson poem that she recites as proof that we still need heroes. I'm speaking for the British now. As proof that the British still need heroes. And it reads, "It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles, whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." Achilles is the bad example, however, in German literature and culture. And I'm going to get to explaining why that is in just a moment. I'll explain the historical context in which he becomes a bad example. That'll be part 1 of this lecture. Part 2, I will address the classical Achilles so that I highlight some of his qualities that are transmitted into modernity. Then I'll go on to Ulrich, the eponymous hero of The Man Without Qualities, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften by Robert Musil. And then I'll finish with Don Draper, the hero of AMC Television's Mad Men. For good reason, the Germans want nothing to do with the idea of heroism after the Second World War. They've just marched themselves and many others into an abyss, propelled by delusions of being the best, and thus show an understandable aversion toward heroes like Achilles, the best of the Achaeans, whose actions send many Greeks and Trojans into the abyss. Artworks that enjoy the problematic designation high art reject the Hollywood formula, the feel-good story of persons of quality winning the day. And they opt for the feel-bad story that shows how, in one way or another, humankind descends from a gallery of prototypes for human wretchedness. That phrase is from Peter Sloterdijk, a German philosopher still writing today. This gallery of human wretchedness begins with Narcissus and Oedipus. And the repetition of their stories and other stories of wretchedness can become just as formulaic as the Hollywood feel-good story. A large segment of cultural production becomes monotone and monochromatic. One hears a jazz clarinet with a broken reed being keyed into escalating and unnerving dissonance, and one sees black. The general demeanor of post-war intellectuals is epitomized by jazz fan and champion of gloom, Theodor Adorno. For example, in The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, he writes, "We laugh about the fact that there is nothing to laugh about." And he formalizes this ethos of humorlessness in his aesthetic theory, where he writes, "In order to survive today amidst reality's most extreme and darkest aspects, those artworks that do not want to sell themselves as affirmation must equal these aspects. Radical art means the same as dark art. Basic color, black." Aesthetic principles such as these empower Adorno and the like-minded to make some rather far-fetched conjectures regarding the hero, a word usually pronounced with contempt. He asserts that any admiration for great and daunting things, for record-setting accomplishment, qualifies the admirer for membership in the bourgeois hero cult. And so if you like heroes, we're only one false cause fallacy away from being able to point the Nazi finger, because the Nazis used the cults of heroes to mobilize the masses. And I think Musil and other thinkers in German literature show us that we need not go this route, that we can appreciate heroic narratives without necessarily risking joining the bourgeois hero cult. So now I'm going to turn to a description of Achilles, here pictured by Brad Pitt, and we're going to have to bracket, particularly the classicists who might be here, will have to bracket what we think about this film, because I'm only drawing on the film because I find the embodiment of Achilles rather accurate, and the depiction of violence is also in keeping with the graphic details Homer gives us. There's 5 aspects that make Achilles a hero: his tragic choice, his singular excellence, his rage, his withdrawal, and his victories. I'll give a brief summary of the Iliad in case you're not familiar with it. The narrative momentum is generated by 2 insults. The first insult comes when Agamemnon, who has just lost his prize, demands a prize from Achilles as compensation. Insulted, Achilles withdraws to his ships and broods for the next 2/3 of the narrative, until the second insult comes, the murder of his friend, Patroclus, at the hands of Hector. So he rejoins the fray, he rejoins the war in Troy, kills Hector, drags him around behind his chariot for a while, desecrating the corpse, and then holds funereal games in honor of Patroclus. There is a sort of an armistice between him and the other Greek captains, and in the final book he reconciles with Priam, the Trojan king, and the father of the man he murdered. We're only going to be focusing on the first conflict because both conflict and tenuous resolution are generated through communication. And I think that's most informative for us today because it gives us a refined understanding of the therapies we have at our avail for verbal conflicts, and also the means for seeking favorable outcomes. It allows us to avoid escalating violence. Imagine if every time you were insulted, you had to kill your enemy and drag his or her corpse around town behind your scooter. Imagine how frustrating this would be for the rest of us who have to drive behind you. That was the scooter joke. And Dr. Hoyer mentioned that she had said to some of you in promoting this talk that I used to do stand-up comedy, so I felt obliged to include a joke into this talk. And the response was good enough, I think. In any event, I'm going to show you a video where Achilles is talking to his mother, and his mother is in fact a goddess. I don't know if that comes through in the video necessarily, but here's a video.
Mother, tonight I decide.
If you stay in Larissa, you will find peace. You'll find a wonderful woman. You'll have sons and daughters, and they will have children. And they will love you. And when you're gone, they will remember you. But when your children are dead, their children after them, your name will be lost. If you go to Troy, glory will be yours. They will write stories about your victories for thousands of years. The world will remember your name. But if you go to Troy, you will never come home.
I should point out that this choice is only considered to be a choice by those around Achilles. For him, there is no choice. His personal excellence propels him to Troy. And it's those who are observing him who can't understand why he would choose a short life and eternal glory over a long life in contentment, though he would have anonymity in posterity. So, by all accounts, by the bards, by the gods, by his friends, by his enemies, and even by his own, humility is not a virtue in classical Greece. Even by his own account, he is the most excellent of the Achaeans. He combines in one person all of the excellent qualities that his comrades and enemies possess separately. Odysseus's intelligence, Diomedes' high-spiritedness, Telamonian Ajax's strength, and Olaean Ajax's speed, the doggedness of Hector, and the beauty of Paris. These qualities contribute not just to his success in war and killing, for which he is often remembered, but also to his success as a speaker. This follows from the instructions that his father gave his teacher when he sent him to Troy. His father said, "Make him a speaker of words and one accomplished in actions. First, a speaker of words." As Adam Perry, a classicist, has keenly observed, Phoenix here makes a practical separation, but no real distinction in kind. The hero must know how to do things in the accepted manner and how to say things in the accepted manner. The two are complementary halves of a hero's abilities, and the obverse and the reverse of his great purpose, to acquire prestige among his fellows. I'd like to modify Perry's observation without disagreeing with it necessarily. He strives for greatness via two modalities. When he's speaking, restraint is required. Restraint of his rage, so that he can say the words he needs to say. When he is fighting, venting of the rage propels him on his way. And anyone who's ever tried to have an argument in a foreign language will know how necessary it is to keep your dander down when you want to say something meaningful while arguing. Achilles' rhetorical prowess has been almost completely neglected or ignored in the German tradition after World War II, or distorted, as is the case of Christa Wolf. In her retelling of the story of the Trojan War from a woman's perspective, Cassandra, she names Achilles das Vieh, the beast, indicating that he is brutish and dumb. John Heath, another classicist, shows us how this distortion doesn't hold if we are familiar with the text. Achilles utters more similes than any other character, invokes distant places and resounding names, and is uniquely given to speaking with directness, richness of detail, and emotive and violent expressions. Furthermore, nowhere else in the Homeric poems is a leading warrior depicted playing the lyre and singing like a bard. Now, this gets us to the title I gave this talk, At War with Words. Achilles goes to war with words. And this means he uses them as his weapon, but it also means he is fighting them, because he cannot make them do exactly what he needs them to do in order to convey the insult and make it felt by his other comrades. And when I speak of words and the words he uses, I'm referring to also related nonverbal things like laughter and silence and smiles, okay? Because these take on import on the basis of what he says. I'm going to paraphrase Adam Perry again to describe Achilles' predicament. When the whole world seems to enjoy this unity of experience that can be shared by a common language, when men say the same things about the same things, and there is no need to define a man's terms, Achilles is outside and alone and unable to communicate the corruption of the heroic code he sees occurring because of Agamemnon's demand for a second distribution of spoils of war. Now, this insult that Agamemnon aims at Achilles doesn't occur in their first exchange. In the beginning, Agamemnon says, I'm going to take a prize in compensation for the prize I lose from you, Ajax, or maybe you, Odysseus, or perhaps you, Achilles. Ajax and Odysseus look at their shoes and whistle, hoping they don't get picked, while Achilles says, wait, this isn't going to work. He begins with diplomacy. He's not accusatory towards Agamemnon. He says, it is unbecoming for the people to call back things once given. Give the girl back, and we'll repay you 3 or 4-fold the next city we sack. Agamemnon rejects this idea and accuses Achilles of trying to cheat him. Things escalate. Achilles points out that he doesn't have a dog in this fight. I, for my part, did not come here for the sake of the Trojan spearmen to fight against them, since to me they have done nothing. But for you, for your sake, O great shamelessness, we followed to do you favor, you with the dog's eyes. So dog's eyes are a big insult. You know, if you study German, that a lot of things to do with dogs are negative. And in this case, I don't know if they mean shifty, greedy eyes, but they get repeated, okay? Agamemnon says, if you don't like it, then leave. I won't miss you. You are the most hateful of all the kings here at Troy. Achilles again ups the ante, says, you winesack with the dog's eyes, with a deer's heart. Never once have you taken courage in your heart to arm with your people for battle, or go into ambuscade with the best of the Achaeans. No, for in such things you see death, you coward. Far better to your mind is it, all along the widespread host of the Achaeans, to take away the gifts of any man who speaks against you, king who feed on your people, since you rule non-entities. And that's the first sideswipe he makes to his fellow captains for not taking his side, since he's actually representing their interests as well. Here's where Agamemnon says, well, I was going to take something from Ajax or Odysseus, but you've just made my choice for me, and I'm taking Briseis, your girl. And Achilles says, with my hands I will not fight for the girl's sake, neither with you nor any other man. And any other man means the Greeks and the Trojans. He is effectively withdrawing here from all conflict. He won't fight because you who gave her take her away. The you who gave her is a plural you in Greek. And he's really indicting the other captains for being so spineless. We should note that as persuading as we might find Achilles' words, they're remarkably unpersuasive to the other captains. And this is why he has to withdraw and brood and play his lyre. He can't accept this insult, but he knows he can't vie with Achilles. With Agamemnon. he doesn't share the virtue of losers. This is a word of Peter Sloterdijk. He can't let it go, so he must brood and brood. A withdrawal is only a heroic withdrawal if it creates a sense of loss and panic. Silence is not heroic if no one misses your voice at assembly or on the battlefield. But they do miss Achilles' voice, and they send an assembly after him. In the Iliad, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix come to his ships, but here we have only Odysseus.
Agamemnon is a proud man, but he knows when he's made a mistake.
The man sends you to make his apologies? What are you doing in thrall to that pig of a king?
The world seems simple to you, my friend, but when you're a king, very few choices are simple. Ithaca cannot afford an enemy like Agamemnon.
Are we supposed to fear him?
You don't fear anyone, that's your problem. Fear is useful. We need you back. Greece needs you.
Greece got along fine before I was born. Greece will be Greece long after I'm dead.
I'm not talking about the land. The men need you. Stay, Achilles. You were born for this war.
Things are less simple today.
Women have a way of complicating things.
Of all the kings of Greece, I respect you the most. In this war, you're a servant.
Sometimes you have to serve in order to lead. I hope you understand that one day.
Achilles will never understand that. He is bending and flexible in a number of things, but with regard to the insult Agamemnon has done him, it cannot be made good again. What is missing from this scene is the number of prizes Agamemnon offers him to draw him back into the war. He would make him a son-in-law. He would give him, I think, 7 unfired tripods. That comes out to be roughly $1.5 million in today's currency. He would give him a host of riches, and he still says no, because he doesn't, the code is what is at stake for Achilles. There's one distribution of spoils, there isn't a second one, and that offense is one he cannot forgive. What is required to break him out of this self-imprisonment is another cause, and that comes when Patroclus is killed. After he has avenged Patroclus, killed Hector, he holds funereal games, which all of the Greek captains come to. And this is the second time the Greek captains come to his camp, which is on the periphery of the Greek ships. He's displacing the center of power, where they no longer go to Agamemnon, they come to him. And he is the master of ceremony in these games. The highlight of the games is a chariot race, and he finds himself in the position of almost committing the same mistake as Agamemnon. He nearly distributed the prizes, not in accordance with merit, but not in accordance to who won, but in according to who he thought should have won. This means giving the loser the second place prize. We note here that all the other Greek captains gave approval to what Achilles was urging. That means they were willing to legitimate a second injustice. They are a group of bobbleheads. But the second place finisher, Antilochus, speaks up and says, Achilles, I will be very angry with you if you accomplish what you intend. Achilles instantly recognizes his own mistake, and he smiles. Remember, we're mourning still. So in grim times, a smile can be a many-splendored thing. And here it expresses a psychological state that we rarely receive access to. It expresses Achilles' awareness that he has been caught in a self-contradiction. It expresses a lack of self-seriousness indulgence for his friends, and humor. He smiles and awards the second place winner the prize he is owed. He gives the loser a new prize from his stores. And so overflowing is his generosity that he gives someone who wasn't even in the charity race a prize. A practical two-handled jar. The closing verse of Book 23 underscores Achilles' victory as a speaker of words. He sets out prizes for a spear-throwing contest, and Agamemnon enters, but before he and the other contestants can throw, Achilles says, in effect, Agamemnon, we all know you're great at chucking spears, so we don't even have to throw them. Here's a prize. Why don't you just head back to your ships? This seems like a compliment to Agamemnon's spear-throwing ability, but it's actually a cleverly disguised insult. It can mean a number of things, such as the other captains are just going to throw this because you are the High King, and why go through this charade? Or if they aren't going to throw it, you might lose, and that would be embarrassing for all of us. So let's allow you to save face. In any event, he says what he says, and Agamemnon, Lord of Men, did not disobey him. So we see, at least in the delimited context of the funereal games, that Achilles has usurped Agamemnon's authority. Now I'm going to transition to Achilles in modernity. And we have to keep in mind that the evolution of Achilles doesn't transpire without alterations to form. There can be multiple features included in the next rendition of Achilles to achieve a similar effect. And I'll explain how this is especially the case with Don Draper, how Don Draper incorporates aspects of Odysseus. But usually when we think of evolution, we think of time only moving in one direction, from the past to the future. But I think an understanding of these modern versions of Achilles enhance our understanding of the classical Achilles and his rhetorical gifts. I'll use the same categories to describe Ulrich and Don Draper: the tragic choice, the singular excellence, rage, withdrawal, and triumphs. I'll give you a little background to this novel. It's a 2,000-page unfinished novel. And we don't know how it would have ended because it wasn't finished, but we know what motivated Musil to write this novel. I quote, "To depict Achilles as hero of the times, not a Zeitroman, a historical novel, synthetic structure, but rather Achilles' conflict with time, not synthetically, but split through him." That Musil twice emphasizes that he isn't interested in synthesis shows that he is moving away from the Bildungsroman, or the novel that aims for a reconciliation between the individual and society. There will be no reconciliation with his hero. And I want to say something here that indicates rather starkly the German disinterest in heroic stories. He is talking of Achilles here as the motivation for this novel. For the first 6 years that he is working on this novel, the protagonist is named Achilles. Yet, there is no study in the Musil scholarship that does a formal point-by-point analysis of the man without qualities next to the Iliad. And you have to imagine what this would be like applied to a different cultural artifact. What if no one had ever thought to use Homer's Odyssey to more adequately understand Joyce's Ulysses? We would immediately think somebody's dropping the ball there. So this shows the type of blinders that are in effect in German studies when it comes to the story of a strong and assertive hero. One more detail that just illustrates how stunning this is. The latest bibliography put out by the International Robert Musil Society is 169 pages long. And not only is there not, and that's only for the last 20 years of work on Musil in this novel. And not only is Achilles never mentioned in any of the titles, But the words hero, heroic, and heroism never appear either, even though Musil, in his writing on his Poetics, says, I practice a heroic concept of art. Okay, so here's a summary of the novel and its protagonist, actually beginning with the protagonist. Ulrich is born into the hereditary nobility, so he enjoys many of the same privileges of Achilles. His training is somewhat similar, at least on the military side. He's a lieutenant in the Austrian cavalry, a member of the Ulanen regiment, one of the most prestigious cavalry regiments. And then he gets training as an engineer, and he becomes a doctorate of mathematics. So he is a thinker of thoughts, and we see how these thoughts go into him being a speaker of words in the many conversations he gets drawn into. And he is also, or was, a doer of deeds. Now the plot of the novel that features him as a hero, most evidently, is called the parallel action. And the parallel action is one of Musil's conceits. And he's pretending that World War II will not happen. All of the characters are living in Vienna in 1913, on the eve of World War I. And the elite of Vienna decide that they're going to throw a giant party for the 70th anniversary of Kaiser Franz Josef's peaceful rule. And to make this party worth coming to, they have to come up with an idea that captures the true Austria. It's called a parallel action because the Germans, as they often will, irritate the Austrians by wanting to throw another party for their Kaiser who's ruled a mere 30 years. And the Germans think that they can show that the Austrians think that they can show that they're magnanimous by making it a joint party. So Ulrich, and I'll explain how this happens in a moment, becomes the honorary secretary of this parallel action. And he has firsthand access to all of the silly ideas that people propose regarding what is the true Austria. Now his tragic choice is not quite as stark as that of Achilles. It's not short life in eternal glory versus long life in complacency, but rather being great versus being average. And he has a foil in his boyhood friend named Walter. And Walter has just sold out. He is average man. And he's received a cushy job in a ministry, and instead of describing it as selling out, he's telling a tale of victory. And like any good friend, Ulrich congratulates him with the following words: "Do not tell me your victories. You're defeated, and you want to surrender finally and without shame. Now you're in your early 30s, and by 40, every man is finished. And by 50, he sees himself in a contented life, and in addition, will soon have all nuisances behind him. Only those who bow down and conform do well." We can imagine this conversation transpiring between Achilles and Odysseus based on the clip we just saw. This doesn't bother Walter, so strong are his necessary fictions, his Lebenslüge. He just thinks that Ulrich is embittered. Here's a painting of Ulrich. This is how Walter describes his friend, and I think it very well resembles this painting. Quote, "He's a man without qualities. He always knows what to do. He knows how to gaze into a woman's eyes. He can soundly think through anything at any time. He can box. He is gifted, strong-willed, without prejudice, bold, untiring, daring, circumspect. I don't want to go into details. He may have all these qualities, but he doesn't have them either. They've made out of him what he is. They've set his course for him. Yet they still don't belong to him. Whenever he's angry, something inside him laughs. Whenever he's sad, he's up to something. Whenever he is moved by something, he rejects it. Every bad act will seem good to him in some other respect. Always a possible context is what first decides for him what he thinks of a matter." Okay, so this is probably the best description of Ulrich furnished in the novel, though Walter ascribes a negative value to it. whereas the narrator is urging us to see the value in this new anthropology, where we are no longer defined by our essences. We are not our qualities. Rather, we have a constellation of qualities. And if we are agile enough, we can combine them felicitously and help us so that they help us along in our agendas. So Ulrich has made a fairly good name for himself as a mathematician, but one day he decides he wants to stop being a promising young man, is the term. And what motivates him dropping out of life is a headline he reads. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. I have to thank Dr. Sterling for this tip. This is a graphic novel adaptation of The Man Without Qualities. And he reads in the newspaper one morning about a racehorse of genius, and there's the racehorse of genius. And this is the ultimate insult for Ulrich, because he defines himself as being a genius. A genius is synonymous with being a hero in the Republic of Intellectuals, which is a term that is sometimes used to refer to Caecania or Austria. And so he made his peace with reading about geniuses of the boxing ring, geniuses of the tennis court, geniuses of the football pitch, and genius tenors. But when he sees a dumb beast described as a genius, he realizes that the word genius has been totally evacuated of meaning, and he ceases wanting to be one. What he sees as the cause of this devaluation of language is something he calls a tangle of forces. And this tangle of forces serves the Agamemnon function in the novel. It is more powerful than the individual, and it is cruel, but without malice, because it is headless. There is no master to this tangle of forces. This is how he describes it. This is how we first encounter him in the novel, too. He had been timing with his watch all that filled the net of his gaze with whirling haste. Cars, trucks, trams, and pedestrian faces washed out by the distance. If one could measure all the effort it takes for a man just to hold himself upright on a flowing street, one would arrive at, so he thought, while playfully calculating the impossible, an amount compared to which the energy Atlas uses in holding up the world is small. Time moved as quickly as a racing camel, except nobody really knew where to, and nobody knew which way was up, or down, forward, or back. You can do what you want, the man without qualities said to himself, and in this tangle of forces, it really doesn't matter in the least. So he's resigned, and he slinks away from his observation, but in slinking away, he passes by a punching bag that's hanging in his dressing room, and he gives it a fierce and sudden blow that does not speak of resignation. I don't know if this visual really captures how fierce the blow is. But this is the signal in the novel that Ulrich is ready to fight. And we have some clues here. He's thinking of heroism while he's making these observations. He's thinking of classical mythology as indicated by the reference to Atlas. And he's thinking of how classical heroes have been supplanted by a new form of heroism, a monstrous new collective ant-like heroism that people will find quite beautiful. Now, everything I just described, these observations, transpire after Ulrich has already withdrawn from his campaigns. The reader learns of this withdrawal in media res. In the tangle that Ulrich finds himself in, the masses have supplanted character, quantity has displaced quality, and words like heroism and genius have become meaningless. And so he has decided that it's time to take a year's vacation from life in order to find out what would be an adequate application of his talents. In the scene where he's trying to wrap his mind around the tangle of forces, he comes to understand the heroic exertion of doing nothing. The effort it takes a man to hold himself upright on a flowing street dwarfs the energy Atlas uses in holding up the world. But even more than this, it is a monstrous feat that a person accomplishes by doing nothing at all. And at that moment, the man without qualities, was such a person. Musil uses filmic techniques in his prose. We can here imagine a shot of a person standing still amidst a blur of people, cars, and trams rushing past. To stand still when all forces are pulling you in every direction requires far more energy than going with one particular flow, as his friend Walter has. Recursively, this gives us some idea of how much energy was required of Achilles to remain aloof of the fray. But there are limits to inaction. And Ulrich finds those limits one evening when he's wandering through the streets of Vienna thinking about such problems with his fists clenched in rage, and he encounters 3 policemen hassling a drunken worker who has just insulted the Kaiser. Ulrich says to the police, he's just a drunk, send him home to go to sleep. The police say to themselves, there's really too many of us to be dealing with a simple drunk. Let's take this guy along with us too. And so Ulrich ends up in jail. He has to call upon his friends in the nobility to spring him. And a quid pro quo is that he becomes the honorary secretary of the parallel action. Now, as I said, he treats the parallel action as a farce for most of the novel. He has 2 files for all of the suggestions that people are sending in. One is labeled back to, and one is labeled forward to. People want to go back to the Gothic period, to the Baroque period, to the Goethe Zeit, to the state of nature, and they want to go forward to society without Rome's influence, or to society where everyone can have their own kitchen vegetable garden. So he's trying to sort these things out and determining what is the true Austria. And at a meeting that takes place about 2/3 through the novel, when it's becoming critical, they need to have an idea because planning needs to get underway, he comes up with that idea. And this is what he says, and he's impassioned. He suddenly feels moved by his own words. There's only one possible task for the parallel action: to begin composing an intellectual general inventory. We have to more or less do that which would be necessary if Judgment Day were to dawn in the year 1918, and the old way of thinking were at an end, and a higher one should begin. You should form in the name of His Majesty an earthly secretariat for precision and soul. Prior to this, all other tasks will be insoluble or else illusory tasks. In short, he is saying, unless we come to define our terms more precisely and stop throwing around terms like genius, we will never get a grasp on our life as it transpires in the blur of the tangle. He is convincing to those at the table as well. The 2 major power players, a Count Leinsdorf and a Dr. Paul Arnheim, they're both enemies of each other, but they both want to join Ulrich in forming this general secretariat. But alas, they do not, because the demands would be too rigorous, and this plot just sort of dissipates and fades away. So we're not really sure if we count this as a victory, but we can say that Ulrich, for the course of the whole novel, is undefeated. He has his setbacks, but he never capitulates. I move now to the final section, Don Draper. For those of you who haven't been watching Mad Men, it's a television series about an advertising firm on Madison Avenue, and the narrative details the excesses and the successes of the characters, in particular, the hero, Don Draper. Now, Draper isn't faced with a tragic choice at the outset of his narrative. In fact, he's called Dick Whitman before he becomes Don Draper. And in order to become someone who can choose between excellence and average life, he must use a couple Odysseus-like tricks, because he's been born to a prostitute and to a dirt-poor farmer. His birth in season 3 is characterized as being divinely inspired on the mother's side. So in this regard, he resembles Achilles, both coming from a matrilineal divine genealogy. In any event, he's in the Korean War, and he causes an accident that blows up his lieutenant. And he switches identities with his lieutenant. And he doesn't take this lightly. Every time when he has returned home that someone wants to honor him for his military service, you can see the guilt on Draper's face. but the benefits outweigh the cost of that guilt, so he proceeds. Once in New York, he's working for a fur company, and he's doing the advertising for this company as well. And one day he meets Roger Sterling, and he knows Roger is a principal partner for the advertising agency, Sterling and Cooper. And he asks for a job, gets rejected. So he takes Roger Sterling out for the typical 1960s 3-martini lunch and gets Sterling so drunk that he can't remember the next day whether or not he really hired Draper. But Draper reports for work anyway. And Sterling lets it slide, and the rest is history. Draper distinguishes himself. His trajectory is set for excellence. Now I want to repeat the title here, At War with Words. Draper is at war with words in a way that is quite similar to Achilles. He uses words as his weapon, but he also challenges the conventional concept of advertising language that treats it as something vapid and banal. In the very first episode of this series, he rejects the two magic words of advertising, fear and greed, and supplants them with his own definition of advertising.
Advertising is based on one thing: happiness. And you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams with reassurance that whatever you're doing, it's okay. You are okay.
So, the downward, wistful gaze of Draper indicates that he is in fact not okay. But he knows how to sell being okay, and in fact he's selling it to Lucky Strike cigarette company. And in a move that would delight Freud, he's in fact using eros, or love and happiness, to sell thanatos, death. Okay? And his agility with words comes through in his real resounding victory that he makes in a sales pitch to Kodak when he's developing a marketing strategy for a product he calls the carousel. The carousel is a slide projector, and you put your family photos in it and project them. And he starts his pitch by saying that an old pro copywriter, a Greek named Teddy, told him that the definition of nostalgia was pain from an old wound. Now this immediately establishes Draper's connection to the Greek poetic tradition, but it does something more via a slippage that occurs in his definition. He omits the Nostos narrative, the story of homecoming, and he does this as he's showing pictures of his home. He's showing his wife and his children and the dog in his house, and he's not interested in the homecoming. There's a second thing that connects him to Odysseus in this definition, and it's the wound. When Odysseus returns home, he is recognized by his old nurse via a wound in his side. This connects him, but it also separates him from Odysseus and pushes him in the direction of Achilles, because Draper does not reveal his wounds, or reveals them in later seasons only infrequently. So there is no moment of recognition. We have not witnessed the appearance of Odysseus on Madison Avenue. Now, we get a taste of Draper's quietly simmering rage in the breakup letter he writes to Lucky Strikes. And this is a classic case of he said, she said. Lucky Strikes had actually quit the agency, but Draper decides to turn it around to his advantage. And this is a somewhat lengthy clip, so please pay attention to the way sound and visuals work with each other in generating some pretty astounding effects.
Why I'm quitting tobacco. Recently, my advertising agency ended a long relationship with Lucky Strike cigarettes. And I'm relieved.
For over 25 years, we devoted ourselves to peddling a product for which good work is irrelevant. Because people can't stop themselves from buying it. A product that never improves, causes illness, and makes people unhappy. But there was money in it. A lot of money. In fact, our entire business depended on it. We knew it wasn't good for us, but we couldn't stop. And then when Lucky Strike moved their business elsewhere, I realized here was my chance to be someone who can sleep at night. Because I know what I'm selling doesn't kill my customers. So as of today, Sterling Cooper Draper Price will no longer take tobacco accounts. We know it's going to be hard. If you're interested in cigarette work, here's a list of agencies that do it well. BBDO, Leo Burnett, McCann Erickson, Cutler Gleason and Shaw, and Benton and Bowles.
As for us, we welcome all other business because we're certain that our best work is still ahead of us. Sincerely, Donald F. Draper, Creative Director, Sterling Cooper Draper Price.
Good morning, Don. Stan?
Good morning.
Good morning. Any calls?
Yes, quite a few. Mostly reporters and citizens. Dr. Miller.
Anyone else?
Someone named Emerson Foote. And, people from those agencies you mentioned. They're looking for you.
Can you get Dr. Miller?
Somebody used your name to end our business in the newspaper. It's not you, is it?
It's suicide. It's insane. How the hell could you do this? Why would you do this?
Because someone had to do something.
You put the company name on it. You should have consulted us.
Why? To evaluate its strengths and weaknesses? To knock it down to risk versus reward? It's done. And I slept last night for the first time in a month.
You slept, really? You weren't smiling, thinking about the taste of shit that would be in everybody's mouth over breakfast today?
No one asked you to euthanize this company.
What did you expect? For us to pat you on the back? Don't you realize the clients are all going to think you could turn on them at any minute?
I'm not going to explain to you what I did. It's an ad for this agency. If you don't understand it, then you shouldn't be in this business.
You humiliated us by not putting our names on it. You left us with this hypocrisy.
Okay, so there's so much to contend with in this scene, both at the level of words and visuals. First, there are three drafts that lead to this powerful statement. The voiceover is Draper's all along. The voiceover continues while he is swimming, showing how Musil, Ulrich are avid swimmers, by the way. I think that's just coincidental. But it shows how this thought accompanies him in his exertions as well. And then it cuts to the reaction shots of all of the people who will be affected by this letter. There's also a very nice underhanded or backhanded compliment, because he says, good work is irrelevant for tobacco, and here's a list of agencies who can do irrelevant work well. So that's a nice, they don't understand that as a dig, but I think that's there in the text. And there's also what most resembles the Iliad, I think, is the way, here it is, the assembly. He's summoned to the center of camp, yet he goes to the periphery, the corner office, and they follow him into his office to chastise him. They're angry at his deviation from the norm, and the norm here being the affable slinking away of the jilted party so as not to anger the jilter. Lucky Strikes. Draper doesn't understand this logic that Pete Campbell, who splits the Agamemnon function with Bert Cooper, makes. Draper thinks, why wouldn't I bite the hand that feeds me if it stops feeding me, or is feeding me insufficiently, or giving me poor nourishment in any way? And this angers the other principals in his agency, and it does in fact come back to haunt him. He is accused of biting the hand by someone at Dow Chemical, and this angers him. But he goes after Dow Chemical in the next season. And this is the final scene I'll show you of his rage exploding again. But also, what I find interesting is his changing of a definition of happiness from something that would resemble Odysseus's to the one that is more in line with Achilles.
But it doesn't change the fact that we're happy with our agency.
Are you? You're happy with 50%. You're on top and you don't have enough. You're happy because you're successful for now. But what is happiness? It's a moment before you need more happiness. I won't settle for 50% of anything. I want 100%. You're happy with your agency? You're not happy with anything. You don't want most of it. You want all of it. And I won't stop until you get all of it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for stopping by.
Well, you drink if you wipe the blood off your mouth.
Okay, so this parting remark by Roger Sterling, who I think I would argue is the closest thing the series has to an Odysseus, connects the former physical violence of the warrior to the rhetorical force he now musters. And the shift in happiness from individual happiness, of feeling that you're all right, of domestic bliss that he showed in the Carousel campaign for Kodak, this becomes the will to greatness, and the will to have that greatness recognized. He also marks himself as a soldier for hire, just as Achilles was. And he will get 100% for Dow. He wins Dow's business, but his definition of happiness calls to mind something Cedric Williams says about the cost of greatness and the incurable sorrow of being Achilles. This is a very vexing sort of happiness that never lets you come to rest. And when Odysseus visits Achilles in Hades, Achilles says, and this is Whitman's paraphrase, "I have suffered the worst and identified myself with it. You have merely survived." Now, this leads me to my conclusion, which is very brief, and I'm not sure if it's even a conclusion. But it seems like that the lesson we learn is, if we want to be happy, do not use words like Achilles, Ulrich, and Draper do. Use them only in their ordinary manner. Don't question if they furnish an adequate description of life, and don't challenge their meaning, especially not when they are uttered by someone more powerful. Learn to let it go and strive to be average. People who conduct themselves in this way will seldom be wounded, will not often feel nostalgia, and with any luck, by 50, will have forgotten even the urge to be a beautiful deviant, whose conduct serves as an example to others. Surrender becomes possible because the standard language gives us devices for calling it triumph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cesaratto. We'll open the floor for questions.
One comparison that I've heard before regarding Draper is draws more from other characters in, say, American literature like Gatsby. Would you say that probably is in regard, is that, say, Gatsby is drawn from German and Greek literature? Or is that maybe just another similarity that Draper might have to other characters?
I mean, the notion of the charlatan, the person who is a chameleon and changes his identity the way Gatsby and Draper do, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily, we couldn't chart a line of development from German literature into the American literature, or at least I don't have the knowledge to do that. There are instances like Thomas Mann's Felix Krull, where he is a similar charlatan who accomplishes great things through his lies and his tricks. But Draper and Gatsby are sincere in a way Krull is not. They actually want to be a better person, in my mind, in my reading of them. And Krull kind of likes the idea of playing with the multiple identities, of being a heel as well as being a hero.
I was wondering what led you to make the connections between Achilles, the man without qualities, and Don Draper, and got you to research it more?
Before I even started, I'd read The Man Without Qualities as an undergraduate, and I just was intrigued with the book, and I just kept reading the book again and again. The book, if you don't know it, is organized somewhat like a Bible, in that there's many sections to it where there's only 5-10 pages per chapter, and each chapter speaks to a certain dilemma or virtue. And so it's a good reference manual, and I kept using it as such. But then as I re-entered the university, I began grad school, I began researching the novel, and I came upon all this evidence that he's actually thinking about the Iliad, that he's using Achilles as his model, and he's developing his model in contradistinction to Ulysses by Joyce. He doesn't want to tell the story of an average guy trying to find his way home at the end of the day. He wants to tell the story of a man plagued by the drive to be great, and plagued by the fact that nobody recognizes his greatness in the way he wants to have it recognized. And this is what led me to Draper, because there are repeated scenes where Draper will win an account, the most famous one being the Jaguar narrative, where Joan, who becomes a partner in the series, wins the Jaguar account by sleeping with someone who is a decision maker. And Draper learns of all this, goes to Joan, and says, "Do not do this." And the episodes plays with the linearity of time. I mean, it chops it up. It's non-linear. He arrives too late. Joan has already slept with the guy from Jaguar. And when he realizes what happens, when he realizes he didn't win the campaign, he's both disgusted by what his other captains did. He's sorry for Joan, and he's disappointed that he didn't win that glory. So the failure of others to recognize him in the way he wants to be recognized is maybe one of the main similarities that I see between Draper and Ulrich.
This is perhaps a little off kilter, but Waterley, we have this big appeal to the senses, and it's very clear. We can see its power and gain and advertising, and then just in the ancient eras, it was just these philosophers and writers. So can you just comment on some of the differences of the impact and how these themes of heroes and power and manipulation are conveyed?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm dealing with here is what was originally an oral poem that's very formulaic, and it's been argued why it's so formulaic as memory aids and so forth. Let me start again. I'm dealing with three completely different beasts: an oral poem, a major modernist novel, and an ongoing television series. And I think you're right, or at least for me, the television series has the most impact on me because of the force we see, the images interacting with the language. But you can also get lost in the words of Homer and in the words of Musil. And I don't feel that I did justice to conveying Ulrich's oratory capabilities. Because when he is speaking, it's both so forceful but yet so philosophical and subtle. It's not direct like Draper. It's, I'm winning and you don't realize you're losing. And he just takes away from that maybe a smug sense of satisfaction. But what the narrator shows us is that his sense of satisfaction is justified because he gets everybody thinking, even those who were initially opposed to him. So his presence is in demand in the same way that Achilles' presence is in demand. He withdraws on multiple occasions, and people always come looking for him and looking for his input. Draper always withdraws, always disappears, And Pete Campbell is always running right after him the first time he appears in the offices because he needs Draper to go win another campaign for him. So I'm probably not even answering your question here, but I think that we can see the 5 categories that I mentioned. The singular excellence, the tragic choice, the rage, the withdrawal, and the victory, conveyed through different media, but all belonging to the same story. And that's the story of the excellent individual who refuses to submit to entrenched power of the status quo.
Other questions? I have one for you,
okay.
And if somebody else will step up. It's a little bit tangential, but because you put in the Nicolas Mahler comic, I have a question about that. I haven't yet had the opportunity to read it myself, but the sections you showed us from the comic were wordless. Is the entire comic wordless?
It's very sparse on words. They will have a few exchanges that express some of the main dilemmas of the novel. And something, I don't like the graphic novel, I should point out, because I think it distorts the thrust of Musil's novel and pushes our interest into the serial murder narrative of Moosbrugger, which is, there's a serial murderer in the novel that fascinates everyone. And that's one example where in Musil he says, if the world could dream as a whole, it would dream of Moosbrugger. Namely, that we all have these serial killer type of fantasies, and all our dreams would lead to that. And that's something that really shifts the pitch of the novel. And then there will be other things, like he's having this conversation with Graf Leinsdorf, looking for the big idea for the true Austria. And there's something like, if only I could find an idea. And so that's about it. It's mostly visual. But I found it interesting because another thing about the novel, one reason I like the graphic novel, all of the scholarship focuses on the first chapter of The Man Without Qualities. There's been numerous monographs written just about the first chapter, 5 pages. And they suggest that the first chapter, which features an accident, is meant to show us the impotence of the individual in modern society. And this is a narrative that appeals to Germans more because they're feeling powerless after the Second World War. But what none of the scholars focus on is that directly from the scene of the accident, we are led in the subjunctive tense by a pair of passers-by to Ulrich, to the person who could understand what this accident actually means. And in the graphic novel, they skip the accident scene. It begins with Ulrich just staring out his window and then going and punching the punching bag because he's frustrated. Okay? So, yeah, and all of that, as you asked, is accomplished with minimal dialogue.
Other questions?
Sie sind entlassen.
Then thank you very much for coming tonight. Let's give Dr. Cesaratto another round of applause.